Thank you for tuning in to this interview with Theologic. The content of this interview, though not explicit, is centered around a topic that's very sensitive to little ears. Now, with that, I'm thankful to Stacy Besch as well as to my wife Hannah for being a part of the interview and educating us on the issue of human trafficking. Please share this with discretion and spread the word abroad about what's going on in our society as we look at this growing evil. And so with that, may you be blessed as you listen in to this interview on Theologic. Thanks for joining us on this interview with Theologic. I'm Zach Packey, and we are joined together today along with actually two special guests. One is our interviewee, and another is somebody very special in my life, my wife, Hannah Packey, not to be confused with Sean's wife, Hannah. She is joining along with me, as well as our interviewee, Stacy Besch. And it was my wife and myself. We had the privilege of going to hear her speak on the issues that I think our listeners need to hear, on the issues of human trafficking. We went over to Okoboji a couple weeks ago, and we were just we went home extremely sober-minded. And Stacy, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about what led you into the work you're a part of, and tell us about the company you're working for.
Sounds great. Well, thanks to you and Hannah for coming to the Okoboji presentation, and this has been quite a journey to say the least. But I'll start with the beginning of just who I am. I'm Stacy Besch from Algona, born and raised here. Been an entrepreneur and a business owner for almost 30 years. I've been doing public speaking for 25 years, teaching for 8 community colleges around the state for 25 years as well. Been a very busy person. I've always been a lover of the United States and America. And I just had no idea, though, that moving ahead, present day, that I would be out doing this. And so really, how did I get here? I truly believe that God called me on this. I've been a speaker, like I said, for 25 years. I just had no idea that God was molding me to get to the point. Now, when I look back, it's pretty clear, like what He was doing with me. But now I can see what He was doing. And I always tell people the Bible verse, Proverbs 31:8, is my fuel, to be the voice for the voiceless. And so God is definitely using my voice to get out there. And I am humbled that He chose me to do so. Well, about 5 years ago, after our pandemic, a lot of people became awake, right? A lot of people, I believe God removed the veil off of so many people's eyes, not only to what's happening with human trafficking, but just what's happening in our country and our states. And because of that, I feel like I was one of those people that was blessed that God woke me up. And when He did that, I started really digging and researching to what's happening. And I joined Team Iowa. Team Iowa is a group of patriots. We're located all over the state, various towns all over, and we meet every week via Zoom because we all live so far apart. And we either are educating each other on things that we dig into and research, or we bring guests on to educate ourselves. Now, when I say that, we're part of Team America. Team America is that's the whole foundation or the umbrella that we're under. And Team America was started by Jeffrey Prather. He's ex-military. He was a whistleblower on the Fast and Furious escapade that happened. And when you are a whistleblower in the military, you are released from the military. So he wanted to see a movement start across our country with teams in every state that we would bring upon awareness and education and help to fight evil. And he's a very Christian man as well. So I just felt so at home with not only Team America, but Team Iowa. I mean, we're a very active state we look at ourselves as soldiers in God's army, and we're going to try to push back and fight. The good news is we always know who's going to win this war. So I guess I love being on the winning team.
Yeah. Amen.
Well, Team Iowa, about 3 years ago, Steve Corey is our state director from over by Sioux City. He lives in Salix. And he said, we need to identify what do we feel as a team that we're facing? I mean, what's our challenges? What's our priority initiative? So we kind of came up with a list of those. Human trafficking rose to number one. And then when we went around the circle on Zoom, he said, all right, I need every one of you to take on one of these challenges so that we can, help this. Because if we all try to do everything, we're going to, you can't do everything 100%.
Right.
And when he said the words human trafficking, my arm went, flying up. And I always tell people this. I knew at that moment it wasn't me raising my hand. It was the Spirit raising my hand, because I had no idea what I was about to get involved with. I just, again, looking back, He aligned all of this to happen. Well, when I raised my hand and said I would take on human trafficking, and I always tell people, think about that statement. I'm going to take on human trafficking. Again, I had no idea the danger I was putting myself in, the target I'd put on my back. I did not realize the depths of human trafficking, because I tell people that I come from the Johnny Gosh days. I come from the days where anybody that lives in Iowa remembers Johnny Gosh. I mean, especially if you're over the age of 40. And Johnny Gosh was kidnapped and taken. And I thought it was about kidnapping. I thought it was about the creepy white van. I thought it was about the drug houses. For most of us my age, it was the first time that we saw kids on milk cartons that were missing. And that's when my mom started panicking about stranger danger, even in the grocery stores and places like that. So that was my basis of what was human trafficking, was that. And of course, we've all watched all kinds of movies that have steered our perceptions to definitely align with that. Well, when I raised my hand, I was put in right away to meeting. We had at that time 3 full-time detectives in our state of Iowa. We had Greg Hall and David Gonzalez, who were working for Hope for Justice. And then we had Ray Fiedler with the DCI. Now, those 3 men I learned a lot of information from. In fact, out of the 3 men, it's Greg Hall who I spent the most time with, whether it be in person or on the phone. I went with them to some hospitals, some school presentations, some public presentations. And so we were really learning, I was learning a lot and trying to absorb all this information. So that kind of gives you my background to where I'm getting at, today with when I want to get into some of these questions for the interview. But that's what led me up to who I am, how I got involved, and then who I started learning from. And I always tell people that none of my information comes from Google. I want to set the stage and the tone right away. I know a lot of people look on Google, but all of my information not only came from those 3 men, but it came from safe house directors. It came from law enforcement all across the state. And then, of course, numerous survivors and victims themselves that have opened up their heart and their stories to me. And I have to also believe that is God driven, because every time before I do a presentation, Zach and Hannah, I always pray, God, let them please see you through me. And I think when that happens, that prayer, I truly believe that these victims and survivors that are at my presentations or hear about it, they feel inclined to share. And darn well they would not share with me if they didn't see some kind of action moving through the Spirit of God.
Yeah. I was going to mention, so for our listeners, what Stacy Besch has to offer is it comes from high quality sources, from some direct sources. This isn't, she didn't watch the movie Taken and then get her ideas from whatever Hollywood is pumping out. This is something that, as the title of this is happening in Iowa, of all places. And so if you're listening from a different state, if it's happening in Iowa, it's happening in a much, maybe more populous state. It's happening probably where you're at, if you're in North Carolina or Florida, wherever you are. And so driving our attention to the sort of awareness, listeners, is something that I hope, and I'm sure, and I'm confident because of what Stacy did for us when we heard, this will give you information on knowing what to look for even in your own state, as much as you've seen perhaps of what what you might hear about what's happening in Iowa. But before that happens, I haven't got a chance to really bring my wife on Hannah, do you have any questions or comments that you want to bring out?
Oh, I just actually was going to say, Stacy, when you did your presentation, I appreciated that it wasn't just full of fear. When you hear that Iowa is number 3 or that this is happening quite prevalently in our state, it's horrible to think about. But I do also appreciate the ways and the means that you give us to actually also help. Right. I love that. There's action steps and there's different things that you're bringing out. At the end, again, I know we're going to go through things, but for those that haven't seen her presentation called Grid Shock, I would highly recommend it. Yeah. I know, Stacy, you've done quite a few of these presentations. How many so far? I know Okoboji was number what for you?
I just finished the Saturday night number 150.
150.
So I was kind of and I was in Miami, Florida for that one.
Yeah, we actually just my father-in-law stopped by our house and we got on the topic of human trafficking, and he said, "Have you ever seen the documentary? I can't remember the name. You mean Grid Shock?" Yeah. So somebody came to my school because he's a school teacher and talked to the kids about. You mean Stacy Besch? Yeah. How did you know that? So what you're doing is connecting along with other people that are in our lives, and you're spreading the word, and that's something that's been very valuable. So let's talk a little bit about, like Hannah brought out, you're not just trying to raise an unhealthy kind of fear. How do we make sure that we're being sober-minded, but not consumed with an unhealthy fear, or in the other end, you have people that are just completely oblivious?
Well, I agree that, I don't try to instill fear in people, but I want to instill that, oh my goodness, this is happening. So we got to get to the reality check that it's happening and that we can't be ignorant about it. But there's always hope, right? I always want to make sure that people know that I would not be doing this whole journey of going out and presenting as a volunteer. I just want to make sure people understand that. Like, I'm not getting paid by Team Iowa. I feel God called me to do this. And when God calls you, you do it. And I'm a volunteer. I would not do it if I didn't feel there was hope. And, there's definitely hope in this. And so that's why I've been going out and, like I said, doing as many presentations as possible, because I know even if it makes one difference to one person, this is worth every bit of hours and time that I put into it. Now, when you talk about that film, Grid Shock, the documentary, I want to let the audience know that Grid Shock, they can purchase online themselves. Yeah. It was produced by Vanessa McNeil. She's an Iowa native. She went to Iowa State University and then went on to UNI. And it was while she was there getting her master's that she put this film together. Now, Team Iowa, we bought the educational license for it so that we can show it to any audience, but anybody can watch it. And I always tell people, when you watch it, even if you're from another state, just implant your state's name in place of Iowa when you're watching it, because it sets the foundation for what is human trafficking, like kind of defines it, kind of brings it up to speed from what we used to think about it back in the 80s and 90s to what it is really today, who's involved. A lot of people don't even know what the term John means. What is a John? And then what is policies and legislative and all that things have to do with it when it comes to laws. And then, of course, it kind of gets down to a little bit of the seeds that I believe are a huge part of this. Now, we knew as Team Iowa, like if I wanted to go out there and start bringing awareness on this heavy topic, it was going to need more than just Stacy going out and just teaching what I learned from the detectives. So when we bought the educational license, it was to show it, to build the foundation. And then my presentation afterwards is just a verbal presentation, but it has evolved immensely over the past 2 years, because I started doing this in the summer of 2023. And in 2 years, not only have I met numerous and hundreds of people and heard, again, hundreds of stories, I've just started compiling, like, what does the audience need to hear? How can they be aware? How can they be feel empowered to take on action, to be with me in this fight? So that's how this whole basis of the presentation kind of came together. And I really do believe that my years of speaking, and, I hired a tutor way back in the beginning of me speaking on how to write a program, how to grab the attention of the audience. And that all of that education brought me to today. Now, when I say that, when it comes to human trafficking, just like what Hannah alluded to, is the first thing we got to get to people is that why is Iowa so prevalent, or any state for that matter? And I'm going to go back just to the United States. The United States of America is the number one consumer of child trafficking and child pornography. We're the number one consumer in the world. So if we just get your arms wrapped around that first, if we're number one in the world, which means we have the highest demand in the world, and that falls on all 50 states' shoulders. We have the highest demand. And we know that this whole industry is a supply and demand issue. We wouldn't need the supply, which is our numerous and hundreds and thousands of children and victims. We wouldn't need the supply if we didn't have the demand. So let's first wrap our arms around that. Then the second part would be the state of Iowa. The state of Iowa, what I was taught back 2 years ago from the detectives, is that we were number 3 in the nation based on per capita. Now, when somebody asks me, what does that mean? Per capita, based on our population of Iowa, but also most of the stats that you see out there, and I'm going to clear up stats here in just a second. Most of the stats are based on, for human trafficking, on reports. How many human trafficking reports are there? And so if we're number 3 in the nation based on per capita versus reports, but I also want to share with you that most of the people I talk to in this industry, as far as combating this, would tell you that reports are only 10%. So there's so much not being reported. Now, when I was just in Miami, Florida, just this last weekend, speaking there at a big human trafficking event, Florida claims that they are number 3 in the nation based on reports. They don't say per capita. They said that they're number 3 based on reports. Now, here's when I was talking to, his name is Victor. He is a former FBI agent on Homeland Security and works only on human trafficking. Him and I were sharing a lot of information back and forth together this last weekend. He said, you know what? We should not get ourselves wrapped up in stats because they change dramatically. You can get them from numerous resources. And I agree. I always tell people stats can change, and I don't wrap myself up in those numbers because even though I was taught that we were number 3 based on per capita, Google says we're number 13, but it does not say per capita. And again, none of my information comes from Google. But I look at it this way. I don't care if Iowa or Florida or North Dakota or wherever, if we're 1, 3, 13, or 49, if we can make a difference, it's worth talking about.
We as the church and as Christians, often we will stand against things like abortion. And even if our state isn't the highest level of abortions that take place, we'll still stand against it because it's an evil, whether you're in Iowa, whether we're in California, whether you're in Missouri, wherever you are. One person being delivered, one child being saved, in whether you're talking about abortion or in trafficking, will make the difference, especially if we're raising awareness in a way that is true and gives us the fuel and the hope to be able to help out and actually make a difference.
So, Stacy, when you say that you start presenting this, there are usually a lot of kickback, correct? There's misunderstandings regarding what trafficking even is. Would you feel comfortable maybe also talking a little bit about maybe those that you have an opportunity to clarify for people, or
like myths and things like that?
Well, I would say the common myths almost always is that people think it's about abduction and they think it's only at our truck stops and interstates. That's hands down number 1 misconception. The second misconception is that these people out there are prostitutes. And of course, if you'll understand that more in the documentary if you watch Grid Shock. But I would always tell people I was in the same boat as them. I thought the same things. And all of that is such a small piece of the pie, meaning that abduction is only 8%. So again, when I give out stats, I'm giving you the stats that I was taught by the detectives, but abduction is only 8%, which means the transportation of victims, and transportation, of course, happening along our interstates and truck stops, is about a small 8% piece of the pie. Now, that means there is some trafficking happening at our truck stops and our interstates, absolutely. But what people don't understand is that most of this is happening right in our backyards. It doesn't matter if you live in a city or you live in rural America, it's happening in our backyards. And when people look at this and say, well, it's prostitutes, these people are out there just selling themselves. Well, the other stat I was taught was that 90% is being forced. So when you start to look at a prostitute or somebody online that they're trying to sell themselves, I want you to look at them with a different eye and realize most of them is by force, fraud, or coercion. And what is the definition of human trafficking? Those three words: force, fraud, or coercion. And if any one of those three, it doesn't have to be all three, if any one of those three is involved, it is human trafficking. And so most of these victims, they're not making the money themselves. I mean, they're handing it over to, a trafficker, and because they're being forced to do it. And, I always tell people, the other thing is human trafficking has now exceeded narcotics. We do have a drug problem in our nation, but drugs, let's think about it, everybody. You can only sell them one time and they're gone. Yes, they make a lot of money off of them, but how can you make more money? These traffickers have learned that if you sell a human being, you can sell that human over and over and over again, and they're never gone because you can force them to do it. And so it's lucrative to their pocketbooks that they're making more money. Well, how do you do that? It's any business model. If you look at any business model out there, they can make more money off of a human being. And with the United States having the highest demand, it's become a huge business in the United States.
People tend to think that if somebody's out on the street or if somebody's selling themselves online, that it's voluntary, that they're doing it by themselves, but very often it's not. I mean, is it also true that those who are being trafficked are also used in things like pornography or other sorts of things as well?
Absolutely. I think, if you want to get into that at some point here in the interview about, the weeds of the garden, I call it. That's the analogy I give in my program. But, with pornography, but a lot of the victims that I have come across that were trafficked as children, most of them were being sold into filmmaking, into child pornography.
It's also interesting to me that you talk a lot about the Johns. But this understanding, raising awareness in this way, actually will help that consumer understand. Sometimes people think I'm paying for a product or a service, and they are giving it, they're offering it, when in reality, oftentimes they're blind to the fact that it is, like you said, coercion. And that helps that just adds another reason why not to do. Right.
Yeah. Why, if you're struggling with pornography, get help. Those kinds of things, it will lead you into further and further debauchery. Give us a little bit of information about what's happening with this trafficking then.
I tell people, especially when it comes to the state of Iowa, our laws for years were a slap on the wrist. So when we've had a slap on the wrist type of law, now what that means for people that understand felony charges, we were a Class D felony charge for years and years. And I always give the comparison because law enforcement has taught me this. You could go to Walmart and steal a $1,000 TV, and that is a Class D felony. So for years, we've been treating traffickers as somebody who is stealing a TV. You might get up to a couple years in jail, and you might get a $1,500 fine. Well, I'm sure you guys probably remember me saying, from that film Gridshot, Heather in the film, she was making $60,000 in 12-hour periods. Well, if you're making that kind of money for one trafficker, a $1,500 fine means nothing to them. They don't care about paying a $1,500 fine. That's pocket change to them. We've had so much leniency to these traffickers. Then the other thing was with part of our laws is that our definition of law was that we were only charging the traffickers. We weren't ever charging the Johns. And Hannah, what you just said, the buyer, these buyers think, they're paying for a service. They're going to get it. Never looking at this that's a victim. They're thinking they're going to this brothel and, buying a woman who wants to do this. And more than likely she doesn't want to do this. And these Johns, who are the buyers, they are just as much as guilty with the traffickers. And why? Because if we didn't have the demand, we wouldn't need the supply. So the traffickers are just trying to create the supply, and then the demands are buying it. So it's all part of that business model. Well, as Iowa nice people, and this can apply in many states, but truly Iowa nice, we tend to turn the cheek. And why? Because we always like to see the good in people, which is not a bad thing. But if we are turning the cheek saying, that guy down the street, there's no way he could be involved. Like, there's just no way. I've known him for years. He's a good guy. And we tend to do that a lot here in Iowa. And We tend to think if it's happening in our backyards, it's not my backyard. I know everybody. And then when we do find out it's somebody we know, we don't want to get involved because we know people.
Yeah. What is the typical process of somebody who gets trafficked?
Present day, the typical process is that over 90% are being lured in through their phones. Traffickers had to get smart. This is why only 8% is abduction anymore, because we have Amber Alerts. We have social media. I mean, you know it. You look on social media, and if somebody's missing, they're automatically their pictures are up on, Facebook or Instagram and saying, hey, if you see this person, they've gone missing. So traffickers have learned that it's too risky for them to abduct people. And it's more valuable to them to lure vulnerable people who they can easily manipulate through their cell phones. Once they are easily manipulated, sometimes it's through pictures. People will take pictures on social media through the gaming apps or chat apps on their phone, mostly nudity pictures. And now traffickers will use that against them. They'll either use the nudity photos for pornography and use the photos that way to basically they're a trafficked victim as far as sextortion, or they will lure them into, hey, you need to meet me or I'm going to expose these types of photos and I will ruin your life. And then what happens is these people show up, these victims, and then they are sold into a sex slavery situation. Now, 50% are being trafficked by someone they know. And this is a hard one for people to wrap their arms around. 50%, it could be parents. It could be an uncle, a relative. It could be a boyfriend or girlfriend. It could be the neighbor next door who is selling them for sex to make money off of them. It's hard to believe that there's that much evil in there, but I know we're on a Christian podcast and we all know that there's so many demons out there flourishing and Satan himself is orchestrating all of this. But the trafficking can go many avenues once that happens. Obviously for the ones that are abducted, sometimes they are put into locked rooms, locked cages, and they are literally sold for sexual pleasures for Johns who are the buyers. But again, most of them are not abducted. So how does that happen? Again, is through their phones. They're told to meet up. I just listened to a victim from down. She's a survivor now. And when I say that, I want to hesitate for a second and say this. The victims that I have talked to have got me trained to say, call them a survivor, not a victim, because they have overcome. They might not be completely healed, but they've survived. And so I've learned to kind of say that instead of calling them a victim, but some of the survivors. So Gloria was a survivor in Miami who was sold over and over again for 5 years by her boyfriend. She was 12 years old when she met her boyfriend, who was 16. She had no idea that he was part of a large sex trafficking ring. And his job was, of course, as a 16-year-old boy, was to go find victims and be sold so that they could make money. And a lot of people have a hard time thinking, what? She lived with her parents for 5 years all through school, and yet she was being sold by her boyfriend? How did her parents not know? How come she didn't tell her parents? And people then do not understand the depths of manipulation that goes behind this.
I don't know. I really appreciated when you did your presentation, you mentioned apps specifically and how they were used. It's not just, hey, watch out for this app, but there was an anecdote with it. This happened or this happened. But do you think you could cover a couple of those apps, maybe based on different genders too? Because you were mentioning young boys versus, girls and how that works. But that was really helpful for me.
And of course, there's so many apps out there, right? And we could sit here all day and talk about different apps, but just based on what I've learned from law enforcement and, again, the detectives and from survivors themselves, like how they were lured in, girls, prior to using the phone for luring people in, they would go to malls, traffickers would go to malls and look for the low self-esteem, easy, vulnerable girls. And all of us can sit back. And if you really were mall watching or, people watching, they're easy to spot, very easy to spot. And so these traffickers would go after them that way and lure them in somehow at the mall. And most of the time, all it takes is a compliment. Catch a girl in the mall and give her a compliment, and pretty soon they become your best friend and you're talking. And a lot of relationships start that way, not realizing that down the road they're going to be used for manipulative purposes of trafficking. But now with phones, the number one app, hands down, that they go after girls is through Snapchat. And through Snapchat, you think about it, these girls are on there. Most of the time it's girls on Snapchat. Granted, there is a lot of, males on there as well, but a lot of girls are on there taking all these selfies and, putting them out there and communicating and chatting and meeting complete strangers on Snapchat. And all it takes is a trafficker to spot one that is low self-esteem, easy vulnerable. And this is how easy it is. They'll message the girl on Snapchat and say, has anyone ever told you how beautiful you are? And that girl, hook, line, and sinker, she takes the bait and she starts communicating with this complete stranger. Now, this stranger isn't going to, people think, oh, well, she's not going into trafficking right away. Absolutely. She's probably not. It probably will take months of grooming her. It could take weeks of grooming her to where this stranger online with Snapchat has created a relationship with her. She's never met them in person, but she thinks that they find her beautiful. They find her attractive. She's smart. She's all these things. And then they get to where they want to meet up. In fact, I just shared I'm always sharing cases on my Facebook page because I'm trying to expose the rats. And we just had a girl from Iowa. She was lured in by Snapchat from a man from Tennessee, and he drove 13 hours to pick her up in Iowa, in Des Moines. Now, she was found, I think, 4 hours away from her home. So she went missing, and that was through the app of Snapchat. Now, back to Hannah's question there, boys. Laura Logan, she speaks out on this a lot. John Rich speaks out on this a lot as far as human trafficking. So doesn't Tim Tebow. So doesn't, there's lots of people who are speaking out on this, which is awesome to hear all these amazing podcasters out doing this. Well, boys are the number one highest paid commodity, and people gasp. I see jaws drop when I say this at my presentations. And this is coming from numerous podcasters who have interviewed, top people that are in this fight. They want boys. They want young boys. They usually are looking for boys age 10 and younger to lure in. And for a lot of us, when we can't understand why would they want boys, that doesn't seem like the normal action for a sexual relationship. And I just tell people to look around this world. We live in a very, very sexually perverted world. And these people want boys. So traffickers, knowing that is a high demand, how do you go after young boys? And they learned really quickly and easily to go on gaming apps. The number one gaming app, and it's not the only one, but the number one is Roblox, Roblox. Every kid that I talk to in front of a school, they know exactly what that gaming app is, and you should see their faces. Parents, though, unfortunately, are ignorant. Parents don't understand the dangers of these gaming apps. You see, it's not the game itself, it's the chatting. There's all these chatting rooms and chatting things that are happening during these games. And these games are hooked up to the internet. So your son, who's 10 years old, could be playing, which he thinks it's another 12-year-old boy, maybe in another town or maybe in another state, who knows? And he thinks he's just playing this game. But it's really not a 12-year-old boy from another state or town that he's playing with or talking to. It might be a 6-year-old man who lives in the same town or a 6-year-old man in a neighboring town. And they get to know everything about your 10-year-old son. They get to know where he lives. The 10-year-old son will tell him what street he lives on, what color his house is, how many siblings he has, et cetera, et cetera. Because you see, a 10-year-old boy, I always say this, he doesn't even know to pick up his own room, let alone pick up on red flags. And that's where the problem lies. Because now this 10-year-old boy has given out all this information. And more than likely, the trafficker will pick up on one piece of information to use it as bait for threats. For example, if he asks the 10-year-old boy, who's your favorite person? And he says, well, my grandma, I love my grandma. She's my favorite person. And she just lives, on Smith Street in town, or maybe she was in a neighboring town. That trafficker will say, if you don't meet me at the park on Friday, I'm going to go to Smith Street and I'm going to kill your grandma. And that 10-year-old boy believes it. And this is nothing that's unheard of. I mean, I hate to tell you how many times this scenario is played out. They use these types of threats because the 10-year-old boy believes it. And it happens to not just boys, it's girls too that they threaten. But Roblox and Fortnite and Minecraft and GTA, which is Grand Theft Auto, all of these games have chatting applications alongside the games that these boys are talking on or girls are talking on. And that's exactly how they lure them in. If I could make a huge warning, the hugest warning I can say to these parents is, I know you're exhausted and tired, and we have 2 working parents in most households, and you get home and your number one thing to do is to be absent from them. Get to your room. You're tired. You're exhausted. You have supper to make. And these kids are on these devices playing these types of applications and games that you have no clue about. And I've always said your job as a parent is to be the protector, not their friend. Just because their friends have these games doesn't make it right. And because you don't understand what's taking place on these sites doesn't make it right either. And in fact, you're putting them in such dangerous situations that I always tell the parent, you're the one that pays for the phone. Take it away. I mean, that's the first thing I would do is take the phones away. If I had to parent all over again, that's what I would do. And if not, start having conversations on what to do. It's called stranger danger. We used to teach our kids about that back in the 80s and 90s. How come we're not teaching that now?
That's an interesting thing because anymore they say to talk about tricky people, the stranger danger or tricky people. So have you actually, because that was my next question, have you had any I guess, feedback from maybe the kids that have survived or maybe parents of different conversations that would be helpful?
There's been so many conversations, Hannah. So many that I can't even count anymore. How many conversations I've had with kids when I've been to the schools who have come up to me either that same day I'm at the school or I could show endless emails from kids who have taken my business card and then emailed me their story. I'm going to say some of the stories are kids who told me that they were like, Stacy, you're right. I was playing Roblox or I was playing GTA and this person started talking to me. And pretty soon they asked me, how old I was, pretty soon they said that they were, either the same age or this girl. I'm thinking of this girl most recent story. She was saying that she was 13F. And that's what these kids will use. I'm a 13-year-old female. So they'll use the codes, I'm 13F. Then the man was saying that he was 48M. So she knew she was talking to a 48-year-old male. And they got to the point where he lived in a neighboring town. And he said, I'd love to come pick you up and take you out. And she knew he was 48 years old. But to this 13-year-old girl, she was enamored by him. He had complimented her. He had said all the right things.
Yeah.
And he was going to come pick her up. And she said, luckily, she turned it down. She got scared. That's just give you one example. That's just one of hundreds that I've heard of a 13-year-old girl on an online gaming application. And, I've had that happen to a boy over kind of in Western Iowa here. He was a gamer and his mom came home from work and couldn't find her 15-year-old son. And when she couldn't track him down through his friends, then she called law enforcement. And when law enforcement had to ping off the towers to find his phone, they found him in a hotel. And when they broke down the door of the hotel, he was being raped by a 56-year-old man, all through the game of Roblox. I mean, that's another story that, I've learned. These kids, unfortunately, I think some of these kids feel like they're not going to tell their parent that they're talking to a 48M or a 60-year-old M or vice versa. They're not going to tell them that. And so they start these conversations with these complete strangers and not having a clue of what kind of danger they're getting into. They think because it's, they have a screen in front of them that screen protects them. That screen's not protecting them. These people can find them where they live and where they go to school and all kinds of things. And I always wondered if these kids, if you were sitting on a bench at a park and the stranger came up to a 6-year-old man and just started asking all these kind of creepy questions, would you continue sitting there and talking to them? Or would you get up and leave or call your parents for help? I'd like to believe these kids would get up and leave. But it's hard to know anymore.
Yeah.
Talk about chipping. You brought that up in your presentation. That's been a big part of things as well. What is that?
Okay, so I like to share with people that the biggest MO of today, when it was abduction, maybe the kid, milk cartons were in place. Again, we're talking about 30, 40 years ago. Present day, again, being too risky to abduct, how can they control people without kidnapping them? And they've come up with two main things. The first one is microchipping. And it's amazing to me, some of the law enforcement I've talked to have never come across this, which shocks me. But also, I've come across quite a few that have been microchipped. Heather, that was in the film, was microchipped for 9 years. Well, what does microchipping mean? Present day, you and I, we can get online and we can buy a microchip, a chipping and tracking device for our cats and dogs. If we're afraid they're going to get lost or we're going to lose them, because look how many people treat their pets as family members. So you can get these things, you chip your animal, and then you can watch it on your phone where they go. You can watch their every move. Well, people are now, traffickers learned that they can do the same things to human beings. And so they will microchip and then, of course, threaten and manipulate the victim that they can watch their every move. If they see them going to law enforcement or a hospital, that they will kill their family before they return home. These are the types of threats that they're getting told. So microchipping has become pretty prevalent. You can have a victim literally living at home with their parents and being trafficked. Again, we know many. I'm going to share with you here on the topic of microchipping. Nothing surprises me anymore, and I pray constantly that God gives me the sense of desensitizing me, because it's heavy sometimes. But just about a month ago, I had a man who rescues women and children in Des Moines. He came up to Algona to put on a presentation for me in the audience we had, and he brought with him 7 survivors. And one of the survivors got up in front of the audience and she shared her story. And she was originally from California, but now is in Iowa. And she rolled up her sleeve and she showed us her arm. And her arm had this terrible, deep, it was just a massacred scar on her arm. And she shared the story that she was microchipped. And the only way she knew she could become free was she had to dig out that microchip. And so one night she sat down with 2 knives and she carved out her arm until she found that microchip so that she could be set free. Wow. And I'm sitting in the front row of this audience and I still get choked up. It's so disheartening to hear and to see her arm and to know that she thought that was the only way that she could become free. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional, but it's so hard. And when I see victims, it's stories like that. Oh my goodness, does that give me fuel to keep my passion going? I'll tell you that. Because I don't want anybody to ever have to go through what she went through. And so it is really, it's serious and people don't get it. And I just was on the phone last week. I called a law enforcement of a large metropolis area here in Iowa, and I was asking him about it. To be honest, I'm going to be really forthcoming here right now. There's so many law enforcement that are clueless on this. And do you know that prior to 9 months ago, anybody who came out of our Iowa Police Academy did not get training on human trafficking?
Wow.
I did not know that.
Yeah. That's not surprising.
And I don't say that in my presentation. Yeah, and I don't say that in my presentations. I'm not trying to belittle law enforcement because I can't imagine being them and they do so much work. But however, we failed at that by teaching people in our law and police academy about human trafficking, what it really is. A lot of law enforcement still look at victims as prostitutes. And then they also don't understand the methods and how they're doing it. So this police officer who told me that he focuses on human trafficking in one of our large metropolis areas of Iowa. He said he didn't even know that about microchipping.
Wow.
I was told that last week. And I said, well, that's funny because I run into so many people that have been microchipped. I had that law enforcement officer from up by Sheldon show me on his phone a picture of a wand. And these wands are usually bought by veterinarians, but these wands can detect microchips on horses, dogs, and cats. Well, why aren't we using these for victims? Because no victim's going to run up to you and say, hey, I'm microchipped. I mean, think of the girl that I just had in Algona who dug out her microchip herself.
I
really want people to understand.
Yeah, that would solve a lot of issues, I think, on the issue of a police officer thinking that was a prostitute. If there's a microchip in there, I think that should be some solid evidence that we're dealing with trafficking and not somebody who's doing so voluntarily. Wow, this has been as it was when we heard your presentation in Okoboji. It's been sobering, and even I hope for our listeners, this will not only raise awareness but also give you some fuel going forward. So let me put it this way: what else do I need to know? You already brought out a lot of what's going on with phone apps and things like that, but around the neighborhood and things like that, what are some signs perhaps that there is true trafficking taking place? Or I don't know if there's a way you can tell that from what's going on other than through the internet or anything like that. Or is there anything you can do by just being able to see and look out? Or how do we tell if there's anything more than that?
And let me get to the second part of the question. Sure. Besides microchipping is a second cell phone.
Oh, sure.
So this kind of goes to the question you just asked, Zach, that what's something else we can look for is a second cell phone. If they don't microchip the victim, a lot of times these traffickers will give them a second cell phone and say, this is yours to keep hidden. You will answer it at my beck and call. You will text and respond, et cetera, et cetera. Now, since you guys see me in Okoboji, I was in Fort Dodge, and a mom was there with her daughter. Her daughter was a sophomore. They came up to me afterwards and they said, Stacy, I'm so glad you talked about this. They said, the mom was telling me the story. The mom found the second cell phone of her daughter, who was a sophomore. The daughter kept having excuses of like, hey, I got to go run this to my friend's house, or hey, I gotta go, to the library, or hey, I got to run this to Walmart. And she said once she found that cell phone and got into it, she discovered that all those excuses, she was actually taking herself to hotels in Fort Dodge where the trafficker told her to be, and then was being raped. I'm going to conclude here with three things here I want to make sure I cover. I want to get to where, let's talk about a couple other things to look for.
Yeah.
And one is physical signs, whether it be tattooing or marking. And I always tell people, and I'll kind of go through this quickly, the number one tattoo is usually on the back of the neck. Yes. And the number one marking of a tattoo on the back of the neck is a barcode. So this does not mean the only ones. If you watch the movie Sound of Freedom, that little girl had a tattoo on the back of her neck. It was not a barcode, but but she had a tattoo on the back of the neck. So those are one place for tattoos. Another place is inside the bottom lip. Yeah. This is a lot of times why we like to go to dental offices, because usually dentists or hygienists might be the only ones to see this, but they will tattoo the trafficker's name inside the bottom lip to show them that they are owned. So that's another place to look. So if you're a dentist or hygienist listening to this, always be aware that nobody more than likely is going to put a name tattooed inside their bottom lip. And back to microchipping, this is why we go to hospitals. If you work in the radiology department, do you have a plan that if you detect a microchip during an x-ray or scan, and then what's your protocol at the hospital? So I want hospitals to be very aware of that. As far as other places for tattoo would be the chest area. I've heard of many stories where the girl was tattooed with a crown on her chest, and usually it had the man's initials or the trafficker's name inside the crown because they like to be called their king. So those are some physical, like literally markings, all the way up to it could be a branding iron on their body as well. Now, another thing is if you have a friend or a relative that all of a sudden has these lavish gifts, like all of a sudden they're wearing expensive jewelry or expensive clothes, or they got a brand new car, and you're like, how in the world did they afford that? Or how did they get that gift? That's another little red flag, because a lot of times traffickers will buy these gifts for their victims to, manipulate them, buy their affection, and then eventually get to where they tell them that they have to sell them to pay for it back. So that's another thing to look for. Now let's get into a little bit of some action steps. You're hearing a lot on this on this podcast here, and you'll hear a lot if you watch the documentary. But number one action step is that we all have to collectively spread the message. Like, we all have to share this story, that if you're not talking about human trafficking in your present life, then you're part of the problem. And I don't mean to be blunt by that, but I'm going to be kind of forward, because we all know that the number one way to eradicate this is we all have to be talking about it to where we know it's a problem. I mean, way back in the days when we had the DARE programs first start popping up in schools, well, the reason we were all talking about DARE was because we didn't want our kids to take drugs, and we wanted to cut the drug problem that we were seeing in our country. Well, we need to focus on this as the exact same way. Let's start talking about human trafficking, what it really is and what it really looks like. So that's the first action step. Your second one is, we hear this all the time: if you see something, say something. Again, your law enforcement, they can't possibly see and hear everything that's happening in your community and in your backyards. So if you notice anything or suspect anything, you got to do something about it. Now, if you don't want to verbally call in and you're afraid of getting involved because you're Iowa nice, then there are anonymous websites. Now, a lot of states do have these. So I would encourage any state to just Google, human trafficking, like how you can report. How do I report human trafficking? Anonymously or on websites, or is there a phone number? So there's some ways that they can do that. The third thing I always tell people is, I know this gets into legislative stuff, but never discredit that you can always be talking to your legislators or even your local county supervisors, your mayors. Get them on board for what's happening, and then how can you make a difference in your community? It has to start at the grassroots. If we don't start at the grassroots, how do we make this explode all the way to our national level? So get working on that. And then lastly, when I started adding this last action step, was a survivor said to me, you need to add another one. And it's one word, and it's the word believe. Believe these victims, believe their stories, believe what happened to them, because so many people say, oh, there's no way that could have happened, or, oh, she's making that up, or she just wants attention. People aren't going to make up these kind of stories. I mean, this is hell they've gone through. They can't possibly make this up. So I want people to realize those 4 action steps are huge. And you might think that, oh, those all seem easy. Well, then let's start doing it. They are easy, but we have to actually take that first step, which is participating in any one of those actions.
You had talked about your 3-legged stool when you had your presentation. I was wondering if you'd go into that, the legislation especially.
So we had a couple bills that were brought to our session this last spring here, and Mark Thompson, who's a wonderful legislator from Wright County, initiated these bills. And one of them was, he likes to call it the 3-legged stool. This 3-legged stool would be that the state of Iowa, or any state for that matter, you would have a huge task force that only focuses on human trafficking. I want you to know, present day in Iowa, just in December, our attorney general gave 2 people that job. We have 2 people in the state of Iowa who that's their number one and only focus. Isn't that a shame?
Yeah.
And if you want to compare that, how come we have over 60 DNR officers in our state? So our state cares more about our DNR, how many people are shooting something like an animal without a license, and yet we only have 2 officers focus 100% on human trafficking. That's super unbalanced. Then the second leg of this stool would be our judicial system. Not only do we have a very corrupt judicial system nationwide, but what I mean by that, there are traffickers paying judges under the table. There's things like that literally happening. But our court systems are so backed up. wouldn't it be great if we had judges who only worked on sex crimes, that we can have a place where these victims can go and the whole process is done effectively? So that's another avenue of that three-legged stool. Plus, let's get to the resources, which is the third leg. More resources to help these victims to heal, to recover, resources to get them to want to show up in court. We don't have a closed circuit video testimony available for these victims when they show up in court. They have to face their predators. Well, that's not okay. They don't want to show up in court then. And so that's why we have very few cases that are coming about. So those are things that we're trying. Now, I want you to know our Senate in our state killed that bill. So it went through our House, 92% in favor, got to our Senate, and they killed it. I have to wonder, and I want all of you to wonder who's listening on this podcast, why would people even say they wouldn't want that bill passed to help with human trafficking in our state when it's so prevalent? It makes me scratch my head.
And along with that, I don't think we ever got to all the work that you had put into getting the felony changed when there is actually a perpetrator declared guilty. Now it's a lot different in Iowa, isn't it?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Hannah, because I forgot about that. Yeah, the good news was the same Mark Thompson that I just referenced for this year's session, back in the spring of 23, he initiated the very first human trafficking bill in Iowa to help bring upon harsher consequences. And we got it passed 100% that year of 2023, to where our governor signed that into law, to where now it's a Class A and a Class B felony for traffickers. And the difference between the two is based on age of the victim, which I still kind of don't agree with, but at least we got it harsher. So a Class B felony for any victim over the age of 18 would be awarded to that trafficker. And anyone under the age of 18, it would be a Class A felony. Now, in me saying that, I've been on the phone a lot with a lot of people in the last couple months. Why have we only had 2 cases in the state in the last 2 years for a Class A felony? And what I'm hearing from people is that we have attorneys and judges who are not fully understanding the definition of human trafficking, which is force, fraud, and coercion. And so they're charging these people with sexual abuse or sexual exploitation and not trafficking charges, which then is giving them a lesser charge. So there's a lot of cases, I will tell you right now, that have been out there and have already gone through the courts with a lesser charge because they did not charge them appropriately, which it should have been human trafficking. And so I think that's another reason why we have only seen 2 cases in our state.
Yeah, it's been wonderful, Stacy. Thank you so much for being a part. Is there anything you wanted to say by way of final exhortation to our audience? Anything else that you'd want to say on this?
If I could just end with one big thing, and this is big, and it is that we are creating the largest culture of sexual predators in our nation today. And how that is happening is that we don't have parents having conversations with their kids and their students. And I know we want to protect their innocence, but let's face it, if we aren't talking to our kids, even about sex at age 8, 9, and 10, and I know that sounds crazy, but that is the number one age that's getting lured in is 10 years old. We need to start having conversations. And what we are seeing is, I call it the weeds of the garden. And those 3 weeds, and the gardens are children. I mean, we want a beautiful garden and we want it to flourish. But we all know that if we have weeds in our garden and the weeds, we don't get rid of the weeds by the roots, they're going to take over our garden. And that's what's happening. And so those 3 weeds, I want any parent who's listening, the first weed that we are struggling is that I won't say all these kids, but I'm going to say a high percentage of kids from age 8 to 18 are taking nude photos. They are. And I know parents just can't believe it, but I've had so many students tell me they've done it. And I know people who have been lured in that way. Nude photos, and of course they think these photos disappear, and they really never disappear. They're in the cloud, and people need to understand that nothing ever disappears. Talk to your kids about the dangers of taking nude photos. The second weed, we have too many students with bragging rights called body counts these days. And this is every high school that I've spoken at. They all understand it and know. They shouldn't say they understand the repercussions of it, but they understand that this is a big deal, that they're using this as bragging rights in schools, is that boys try to come up with a list of how many bodies they can have sex with, and that's what's called body counts. And so think about that. If you're a high schooler and you're bragging that you have a body count of 10, what is that creating for you when you're a 40, 50, or 60-year-old man? You are still going to be thinking, how many bodies can I have sex with, which then makes you a predator by definition. And then the third weed is pornography. I don't think every kid seeks out to watch pornography. A lot of times these algorithms in the game applications that they're playing with, they are sent even short little videos. And all it takes is one little video of pornography to start to stimulate the brain, which gives them a dopamine. And then pretty quickly, these kids are addicted to pornography. Yeah. These kids are not realizing the depths that the pornography was designed as entertainment by the enemy. They're using it as sex ed. And as sex ed now, they're placing on their girlfriends or their relationships that that's what sex should look like. And then pretty soon you're not going to get that from your relationship, from the girlfriend or your spouse. And so then they have said, if you're addicted to porn, you are more apt to become a John. And a John, we have already discussed, is a buyer. And that is the demand which we are dealing with today. Yeah. So if I could beg for anything of parents, I already gave you warning signs of what to look for. But are you having conversations with your kids? Are you telling them about the biblical principles of sexual immorality when it comes to nude photos, when it comes to bragging about how many bodies I can have sex with, which is a sin against your own body, and then of course the addiction to pornography? That's where the problem lies. Yeah. That is where we are creating the largest culture of sexual predators. And that's where I'm begging for help.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the role of parenting by Scripture. Our job is to set a proper fence of protection for our kids, whether that's helping them with their heart issues, whether it's helping them protect them from that which is outside of the house. What are we doing to instruct our kids, to prepare our kids for the world that is out there? There are three things that parents often do. They either fear the world, they forget the world, right? We're afraid of it, so we don't deal with it. We forget it. It's not a big deal. The best thing we can do is face it, understand, which is why we have Stacy on here. Understand what is out there, prepare our minds with biblical truth to be able to face it and stand strong against the evils that are out there. Stacy, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast, and grateful for how the Lord is using you, and may He continue to do so as the years go ahead.
Thank you. I thank you so much for having me, because I know that this is going to bring upon more awareness, even more than what a presentation can do. And so thank you for listening to God to do this.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Theologic. Lord bless you, and you have a great rest of your day.